Imagine being thrown into a meat grinder, completely surrounded by the deadliest army on Earth, only to discover that your own commanders gave you broken toys to fight with. This isn't just another World War II story. This is a story of ultimate betrayal, elite incompetence, and the most audacious, heavily guarded cover-up in military history. For decades, top-secret files were locked away in dusty British archives. Why? Because the raw, uncensored truth about what 14,000 abandoned Australian soldiers did in the searing heat of the Libyan desert was just too humiliating for the generals in London to admit. These men were completely written off, left to rot. The top brass expected them to surrender to Erwin Rommel in a matter of days. But when their utterly useless jamming weapons failed them, these boys didn't wave the white flag. Oh no. They broke every single military rule in the book. They pulled off something so outrageously illegal and so absolutely insane that it completely baffled the mighty German war machine and almost gave the British High Command a collective heart attack. What exactly did these desperate men do under the cover of darkness? How did they turn a disgusting, humiliating insult into one of the most legendary nicknames in the history of warfare? And what dark, embarrassing secret made Winston Churchill turn completely pale just a year later? You are about to hear the real, unvarnished truth they didn't want you to know. Make sure you watch this video to the very end because the shocking comparison I'll reveal in the final minutes will leave you absolutely speechless. Buckle up. We are diving into the sand, the blood, and the greatest military heist of World War II. Let's get into it. April 1941, the Libyan port of Tobruk, early morning. German artillery has been pounding the fortifications for 72 hours without a single pause. Dust, thick gunpowder smoke, and scorching sand merge into one suffocating, unbearable cloud that chokes every breath. 14,000 Australian soldiers of the 9th Division are crouching in shallow trenches, gripping weapons that jam every second time they try to fire. The British High Command, sitting comfortably in Cairo, has already mentally written off the entire garrison. Internal staff assessments gave Tobruk absolutely no more than 2 weeks before total collapse. General Erwin Rommel, having just crushed British units in the open desert and driven them into this port city cauldron, is absolutely certain he only needs to wait for their inevitable capitulation. He did not know one crucial history-altering fact. The Australian soldiers had already started doing what no other army in the world had ever dared to do. They threw away their issued useless weapons, walked out into the pitch-black night, and went straight to rob the enemy. But this shocking turn of events was just the desperate beginning of a much larger disaster. And to truly understand the sheer scale of what happened in Tobruk, you must first understand the absolute garbage the British command handed these Australians to defend a strategic port. Imagine facing elite German armor with anti-tank rifles called Boys, a model from 1939. These things were incredibly bulky, devastatingly heavy, and completely incapable of piercing the frontal armor of German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks at actual combat distances. According to their technical specifications, the Boys rifle could penetrate 60 millimeters of armor, but only at a pathetic distance of 100 meters. Worse still, it only worked if the shot hit perfectly straight on, which meant the barrel had to look strictly perpendicular into the steel plate. In a real chaotic battle, attempting such a shot meant almost certain tragedy for the shooter. It was a suicide mission disguised as military strategy, and the nightmare didn't stop with just the anti-tank weapons. The infantry machine guns, known as the Bren, had an open bolt mechanism that was practically designed to fail in the desert. In the harsh conditions of Libyan sandstorms, this mechanism would clog up with dirt in literally half an hour of active firing. Then there was the standard Lee Enfield rifle, which was perfectly fine for European combat. However, in North Africa, the weapon oil thickened drastically due to the extreme temperature swings, going from plus 40 degrees Celsius during the day to near freezing at night. The ammunition feed mechanism would start misfiring exactly when the soldiers needed it the most. Yet this massive equipment failure was merely the tip of a terrifying iceberg. Beneath it lay a catastrophic logistical nightmare that doomed the garrison from the start. Supplies for the trapped men came exclusively by sea, arriving via night convoys across the Mediterranean while under constant brutal attacks from German aviation. The British Admiralty, terrified of losing valuable ships, allocated only their absolute fastest destroyers for these dangerous runs. The sailors themselves nervously called this route the Tobruk Ferry. Every single trip transformed into a deadly game of Russian roulette. The ships sailed with absolutely no air cover, desperately relying on the pitch-black darkness as their only real defense against aerial bombardment. Under these horrific conditions, the ship holds contained only the bare minimum of food, water, and ammunition for standard British calibers. They almost never carried any essential spare parts, heavy weaponry, or modern anti-tank guns that the men desperately needed to survive. The 9th Australian Division was literally trapped, forced to fight with only what they had managed to grab during their chaotic retreat and whatever scraps those night raids could deliver. By the end of April 1941, the brutal truth became impossible to ignore. The supplies were going to be irregular and criminally insufficient. When the Australian officers finally conducted a desperate inventory, the results were absolutely horrifying. There was a catastrophic shortage of anti-tank guns, just enough machine gun ammunition for maybe 2 or 3 serious attacks, and the number of spare barrels for the Bren guns was practically zero. They were left defenseless in the sand, waiting for an enemy that never slept. Enter General Leslie Morshead, the undisputed mastermind behind this utterly outrageous survival strategy. Unlike the highly aristocratic British staff officers who sipped warm tea in the luxurious safety of Cairo, Morshead was an entirely different breed of military commander. Before the global conflict erupted across the continents, he successfully managed a massive, highly profitable shipping company and was heavily accustomed to thinking strictly in terms of raw resources, ruthless logistics, and wildly unconventional corporate solutions. His incredibly demanding nature and remarkably strict discipline earned him the brilliant, widely whispered nickname of Mini Rommel among his fiercely loyal troops. This spectacular moniker served as both a massive, undeniable compliment and an incredibly accurate description of his relentless, results-driven leadership style. When this former corporate executive looked at the desperately besieged map of the port city, he absolutely refused to see a tragic, inescapable trap. Instead, he saw an unbelievable, completely unprecedented opportunity staring right back at him. Surrounding the ruined city on all sides was a vast, heavily populated enemy territory overflowing with heavily stocked supply depots, parked transport vehicles, and literal mountains of unguarded ammunition. All of this priceless military treasure was theoretically protected by Italian and German sentries who, according to daring reconnaissance reports, performed their nighttime guard duties with a shocking, almost comical level of extreme negligence. Morshead immediately made a stunning, highly controversial decision that would definitely be classified as a gross court-martial offense in any standard British military manual. He essentially authorized his stranded, exhausted men to treat the surrounding enemy encampments as a completely free, highly lethal nocturnal supermarket. The rigid rules of traditional warfare were completely thrown out the window in favor of pure, unadulterated survival tactics. But this brilliant breach of established military protocol was merely the dramatic opening act of an unbelievably audacious nighttime campaign. The highly coordinated nocturnal raids began during the very first weeks of the intense siege and incredibly quickly evolved into a flawless, terrifyingly efficient tactical system. Australian combat patrols would silently slip beyond the protective perimeter of their sandbag fortification shortly after midnight, carefully waiting until the suffocating desert heat finally broke and the darkness became thick enough to hide their daring movements. These specialized, highly dangerous raiding groups typically consisted of exactly 4 to 8 highly trained men. This specific number provided the absolute minimum manpower required for covering a rapid tactical retreat, while simultaneously remaining small enough to guarantee absolute silence across the treacherous, rocky terrain of the desert floor. The meticulous preparation for these highly illegal supply runs was nothing short of extraordinary, completely discarding standard military dress codes for the absolute sake of stealth. The soldiers meticulously removed every single piece of shiny metal equipment from their combat uniforms to prevent any accidental, revealing reflections under the dangerously bright desert moon. Most astonishingly, these cunning frontline fighters completely abandoned their heavy, incredibly noisy military-issued boots. Instead, the incredibly resourceful Australian soldiers ingeniously pulled thick wool socks directly over their footwear to completely silence the treacherous, crunching sounds of the loose desert gravel. Their primary tactical targets were almost always the highly vulnerable Italian positions located on the expansive, poorly defended outer flanks. General Rommel made a massive, utterly unforgivable strategic blunder by utilizing his significantly less motivated Italian units to hold the long outer perimeter while carefully reserving his elite German forces for heavy frontline assault operations. This arrogant tactical decision played absolutely perfectly into the heavily calloused hands of the incredibly resourceful Australian raiders. The Italian garrison troops guarded the vital logistics hubs and essential transport nodes with a staggering level of sheer carelessness, practically inviting the silent, shadowy predators directly into their sleeping camps. The stealthy Australians would slip unnoticed into the enemy trenches, quietly neutralize the sleeping or distracted guards without firing a single echoing shot, and swiftly empty the enemy supply crates into their own woven sacks. Yet the incredible success of stealing basic provisions soon paved the way for a massive technological revelation that completely changed the entire course of the bloody battle. During the course of their first 24 highly successful night excursions, the Australian patrols managed to quietly capture something absolutely extraordinary that sent massive shockwaves of excitement through their underground ranks. They returned to their hidden bunkers carrying brand new, pristine German submachine guns originally manufactured in the year 1940. These were the incredibly famous and utterly terrifying automatic weapons that the hysterical British press frequently referred to as the dreaded Schmeissers. The sheer mechanical brilliance of the highly coveted captured MP-40 submachine gun left the battle-hardened Australian soldiers completely mesmerized and deeply appreciative of enemy engineering. For men who had spent weeks fighting with absolute garbage, holding this weapon felt like stepping out of the dark ages and directly into the glorious future of modern warfare. This revolutionary German firearm featured a highly innovative folding metal stock that made it unbelievably convenient for tight, claustrophobic trench warfare operations. An Australian soldier proudly carrying this spectacular weapon did not need to clumsily turn his entire body around in an incredibly narrow, sandy ditch just to aim at a suddenly appearing enemy target. Furthermore, the devastating 9mm Parabellum caliber provided an incredibly manageable physical recoil while simultaneously delivering a massive, overwhelming stopping power at short, desperate combat distances. The weapon was an absolute masterpiece of lethal, uncompromising efficiency, totally outclassing anything the incredibly wealthy British Empire had bothered to send to the North African front. But the absolute most critical advantage of this stolen German marvel was its brilliantly designed, highly resilient, open-bolt firing mechanism. Unlike the utterly disastrous, fully enclosed mechanical systems of the incredibly rare British Sten guns, the MP-40 was vastly less sensitive to the abrasive, omnipresent Libyan sand and choking, blinding dust storms. The utterly exhausted Australians who had brutally suffered through the agonizing nightmare of constantly jamming Bren guns and tragically misfiring Lee Enfield rifles looked at this reliable German weapon as an absolute miracle of modern industrial engineering. They realized instantly that this stolen, highly illegal firepower was the definitive ultimate key to surviving the relentless enemy armored assaults. And while the imported submachine guns were an incredible, highly celebrated prize, the true crown jewel of the enemy arsenal was still desperately waiting to be claimed in the desert shadows. The incredibly resourceful Australian fighters quickly developed an equally massive, totally consuming obsession with aggressively acquiring the legendary German machine gun known universally as the MG-34. By the strict technological standards of the year 1941, this devastating piece of heavy machinery was an absolutely outstanding, almost futuristic model of heavy infantry weaponry. The terrifying, highly efficient gun boasted a mind-boggling rate of fire consistently ranging from 800 to 900 rounds per single minute of continuous, devastating operation. It featured a highly efficient, incredibly reliable belt-fed ammunition system and possessed the incredible tactical ability to execute a rapid, scorching barrel change directly in the chaotic middle of a furious firefight without requiring any specialized mechanical tools. When you carefully compare this sleek, magnificent German beast to the totally standard British-issued equipment, the utter undeniable incompetence of the Allied military supply chain becomes painfully, embarrassingly obvious. The standard British Vickers machine gun, despite its widely recognized, undeniable reputation for overall structural reliability, was an incredibly heavy, shockingly cumbersome dinosaur of an antiquated weapon. It absolutely required a constant heavy supply of highly scarce drinking water just for its massive cooling jacket and rigidly demanded a dedicated operating crew of several incredibly strong men just to slowly move it across the treacherous battlefield. In incredibly stark, humiliating contrast, the spectacular German MG-34 could be easily carried, rapidly mounted on a bipod, and fired by one single determined soldier in significantly less than a minute. In the brutal, highly unpredictable reality of high-stakes, close-quarters trench warfare, where defensive positions frequently shifted multiple times over the frantic course of a single chaotic night, this extreme physical mobility provided a critical, absolutely life-saving tactical advantage. Realizing the immense, completely undeniable tactical superiority of this specific automatic weapon, the incredibly bold Australian raiders began to deliberately and highly aggressively hunt specifically for these powerful machine guns during their incredibly dangerous nocturnal excursions. The very first captured units of this freshly liberated high-tech German weaponry were immediately integrated directly into the frontline defensive network without a single moment of bureaucratic hesitation. The devastating, highly bloody results on the contested battlefield were so immediately obvious and spectacularly undeniable that this heavily illegal practice instantly escaped the tight control of any possible official military prohibition. However, the shocking reality of this completely underground military supply operation was about to completely humiliate the incredibly proud Axis frontline commanders. The unsuspecting Italian sentries standing lonely guard in the freezing desert nights had absolutely no idea that they were being aggressively stalked by men who had essentially turned into invisible, highly tactical ghosts. The terrifying, incredibly unnatural silence of the advancing Australian raiders, entirely made possible by those surprisingly thick wool socks and their total, stubborn refusal to carry any clinking metallic gear, created an atmosphere of pure psychological horror for the highly nervous Axis guards. Unsuspecting sentries would be quietly neutralized and permanently removed from the equation, their heavy, highly valuable weapons meticulously unbolted from their defensive steel mounts, and their heavy ammunition crates completely emptied before anyone could even attempt to raise a basic vocal alarm. By the time the blinding, scorching African sun finally rose violently over the eastern horizon, the incredibly confused Italian officers would regularly discover totally empty weapon stands and absolutely zero physical trace of the audacious perpetrators. This phenomenal, highly illegal aggressive procurement strategy fundamentally and irreversibly shifted the entire military balance of power within the deeply besieged, crumbling fortress city. The incredibly talented Australian mechanics, many of whom possessed incredibly valuable hard-earned experience repairing heavy agricultural machinery back in their harsh, unforgiving homeland, joyfully tore into the stolen German hardware with absolute childlike fascination. They incredibly quickly mastered the highly complex internal mechanisms of the coveted MG-34, meticulously cleaning the abrasive sand out of the pristine steel components and eagerly preparing them to rain absolute destruction upon their former, highly arrogant owners. They were not merely surviving the brutal, seemingly endless siege, they were actively, highly aggressively adapting, evolving into a highly lethal modernized fighting force completely powered by the entirely unintentional generosity of the famous General Rommel. For a common, deeply exhausted infantryman who had literally watched his officially issued rifle completely fail during a desperate, intense confrontation, the incredible, empowering feeling of holding a fully functional, highly reliable German automatic weapon was absolutely, undeniably intoxicating. The heavy, incredibly reassuring physical weight of the newly acquired MP40 quickly became a powerful, deeply emotional symbol of their fierce, unstoppable independence and their total, unapologetic rejection of the catastrophic British logistical failures. They completely and utterly ignored the incredibly strict, highly formalized rules of military engagement mandated by the entirely disconnected aristocratic generals located safely overseas. Instead, they fully embraced a primitive, utterly ruthless, and highly pragmatic operational philosophy of taking exactly what they desperately needed to ensure they saw another sunrise. But the absolute sheer audacity of these hardened, highly motivated frontline fighters was about to rapidly escalate to a completely unprecedented, totally unbelievable historical level. The incredibly massive firepower provided directly by the captured MG-34 machine guns effectively and violently neutralized the massive numerical troop advantage previously held by the heavily attacking Axis infantry battalions. When the highly trained German shock troops boldly charged across the open, totally exposed desert sands, fully expecting to easily overrun defensive positions supposedly manned with malfunctioning, unreliable British firearms, they were suddenly met with a solid, utterly impenetrable wall of screaming hot lead. The staggering, absolutely terrifying rate of fire of 800 to 900 rounds per minute absolutely decimated the proudly advancing ranks, rapidly creating an impenetrable, highly lethal zone of devastating total destruction. The supreme, incredibly dark irony of the supposedly invincible German war machine being brutally, violently stopped in its tracks by its very own spectacular engineering masterpieces is a deeply humiliating, highly embarrassing historical fact that the Axis commanders desperately tried to completely suppress for many long years. The spectacular, highly successful technological rebellion, engineered secretly by General Leslie Morshead and executed absolutely flawlessly by his fearless, incredibly resourceful men, proved beyond any possible shadow of a doubt that rigid bureaucratic rules mean absolutely nothing in the brutal face of sheer, desperate survival. They did not just passively, hopelessly wait for a glorious rescue operation that was never actually going to arrive from the cowardly, highly incompetent command centers located hundreds of miles away. They actively took absolute, highly aggressive physical control of their own bloody, incredibly violent destiny, permanently transforming their desperate, supposedly starving garrison into a highly terrifying, incredibly lethal fortress bristling with top-tier stolen firepower. The rapidly growing legend of their incredible, highly audacious nocturnal military heists was rapidly spreading through the dusty trenches, forever cementing their undeniable, highly respected reputation as the most dangerously resourceful, completely unpredictable soldiers to ever fight in the brutal North African theater. Hoarding thousands of stolen German submachine guns and devastating rapid-fire heavy weapons was a massive, highly illegal triumph. But these incredibly audacious Australian scavengers absolutely refused to stop at simple infantry hardware. Operating entirely under the totally unofficial but highly encouraged military doctrine known widely throughout the dusty garrison trenches as organized scrounging, these desperate men rapidly elevated their nocturnal thievery to a completely mind-blowing, entirely unprecedented new level of sheer criminal genius. The massive Italian motorized corps, currently stationed across the vast, freezing North African desert, heavily utilized an incredibly extensive fleet of transport vehicles. They predominantly relied on incredibly expensive, high-quality models manufactured by famous brands like Fiat and Lancia. In these extremely valuable logistical assets were routinely parked overnight in massive, incredibly vulnerable desert staging areas. They operated with an almost comical, astonishingly minimal level of basic security. The highly arrogant Italian commanders simply could not fathom the completely impossible idea that a heavily besieged, theoretically starving enemy garrison would possess the absolute reckless insanity required to launch highly coordinated vehicle heists deep within their own secure rear positions. Specialized groups of stealthy Australian commandos flawlessly executed massive, completely silent vehicle robberies right under the very noses of the exhausted, deeply sleeping Axis forces. But this outrageous, highly illegal vehicular procurement was merely the deeply embarrassing opening act of a massive, heavily suppressed Italian military scandal. The incredibly embarrassing saga of the completely vanished, magically repainted enemy trucks quickly became one of the most hilariously legendary, highly celebrated parts of the entire bloody siege. The highly valuable stolen Axis transport machines were always rapidly, completely successfully delivered back into the heavily fortified Australian lines, hours before the blinding desert sun could even rise. During the long, scorching daylight hours, highly skilled teams of Australian mechanics immediately descended upon their freshly acquired motorized prizes. They aggressively applied thick, heavy coats of standard British desert camouflage paint directly over the highly recognizable, brightly colored Italian and German military markings. By the time the blazing evening sun finally set across the devastated, heavily cratered Libyan landscape, a previously stolen enemy logistics truck was already fully integrated directly into the official garrison transport fleet. The utterly bewildered Italian logistics commanders continuously received highly panicked, deeply confusing official reports regarding the sudden, completely inexplicable disappearance of their most valuable heavy machinery. They had absolutely no logical, coherent explanation for their furious superiors. Faced with this totally humiliating, seemingly impossible situation, it was significantly easier and far less professionally embarrassing for the deeply ashamed Axis officers to officially classify the missing vehicles as completely destroyed in heavy combat operations, openly admitting that deeply exhausted, practically starved enemy infantrymen were literally stealing their massive trucks directly out of their secure sleep camps would have caused an absolutely catastrophic collapse in regional military morale. Yet, the absolute, undeniable, crowning achievement of this spectacular, totally illegal underground supply chain was a legendary, highly celebrated nocturnal operation that the deeply amused Australian troops forever immortalized simply as the absolute greatest shopping trip in the entire history of Africa. A highly specialized, heavily armed reconnaissance squad consisting of exactly 6 determined Australian soldiers quietly slipped past the fortified perimeter wire. Instead of discovering heavily armed enemy cannons, these incredibly stealthy, highly focused nocturnal hunters accidentally stumbled directly into a massive, heavily stocked Italian rear logistics camp. This camp featured an incredibly beautiful, highly active field kitchen with massive boiling cauldrons. The overwhelming, incredibly intoxicating aroma of genuinely fresh, beautifully baked, traditional Italian bread instantly stopped the highly disciplined commandos right in their dusty tracks. This was an absolutely massive, unbelievable luxury compared to the literal, tooth-breaking, rock-hard, British-issued combat biscuits. The highly patient, incredibly focused commandos silently waited in the freezing desert shadows. They stayed perfectly still until the utterly unsuspecting Italian combat chefs finally walked away to fetch more fresh water from the nearby supply tanks. The stealthy Australians rapidly moved in and immediately lifted the massive, incredibly hot cauldrons full of deeply rich, heavily seasoned meat stew directly off the roaring cooking fires. They swiftly loaded the entire spectacular culinary treasure directly onto a stolen enemy utility trailer. Oh, they then successfully, completely silently towed the entire massive, highly illegal culinary haul back into the deeply besieged city without firing a single warning shot. The following highly joyous morning, the entire starving garrison sat in their heavily bombarded, dust-filled trenches, happily eating genuinely fresh, spectacular Italian bread and absolutely magnificent piping hot beef stew. In the official, highly scrutinized morning combat report, the incredibly brilliant, deeply amused unit commander simply submitted a gloriously brief, completely understated official sentence. He officially declared that his highly skilled team had successfully conducted an incredibly effective reconnaissance of deep enemy positions and successfully secured essential, highly valuable supplementary dietary provisions. But absolutely all of this incredible, highly amusing logistical thievery paled in sheer, terrifying comparison to what these desperate, incredibly dangerous men did with captured Axis heavy armor on the violently contested, deeply blood-soaked battlefield. The highly explosive, completely devastating Easter battle, furiously waged on the 1st and 2nd days of April in the violently bloody year of 1941, became a historic milestone. It was the very first massive, completely overwhelming physical collision where heavily armored German tanks received a massive, completely unexpected, brutal beating directly from captured enemy weaponry. The brilliant, highly aggressive General Rommel confidently hurled his entire, incredibly powerful 15th Panzer Division directly into a massive, highly coordinated, heavy assault. This was meticulously designed to completely shatter the vulnerable southern sector of the Australian defensive line. According to the heavily planned, highly confident German operational blueprint, the massive steel tanks were supposed to brutally crush the highly exposed forward defensive trenches. They would rapidly break deep into the vulnerable rear logistical areas, instantly creating an absolute catastrophic panic. However, against these deeply hardened, heavily armed Australian scavengers, absolutely nothing from that famous, highly celebrated tactical textbook actually worked as intended. The completely cornered, heavily defiant soldiers utilized an incredibly brilliant, highly dangerous defensive strategy that they had completely invented themselves. The desperate frontline infantry trenches were highly intentionally dug extremely narrow and surprisingly shallow. When the massive, terrifying waves of German panzers aggressively charged directly into the massive assault, the highly disciplined, heavily armed infantry completely refused to retreat a single inch backward into the heavily contested city limits. Instead, they forcefully pressed themselves completely flat directly against the sandy, vibrating bottom of the narrow trench. They bravely allowed the massive, crushing steel tracks of the terrifying enemy tanks to violently roar directly over their unprotected heads. The hard desert earth violently shook and groaned under the incredible, crushing weight of the massive machines. Blinding, suffocating clouds of hot, abrasive sand violently rained down everywhere, but the highly courageous men incredibly managed to remain completely alive and highly focused. This incredibly terrifying, highly successful tactical maneuver was just the initial massive shock that preceded a completely overwhelming, highly coordinated, and utterly devastating technological nightmare for the wildly overconfident attacking forces. Immediately following the massive initial crushing wave of heavy frontline tanks came the highly exposed, heavily armed German infantry battalions. This was the exact highly critical moment when two completely massive, absolutely devastating surprise elements violently entered the horrific, deeply bloody equation. The very first, incredibly brutal, tactical element consisted of highly lethal, totally improvised, explosive grenades. These were completely manufactured from empty, heavily discarded army food tins packed tightly with highly unstable raw explosives and razor-sharp jagged shrapnel, which the resourceful men had quietly assembled directly inside the active combat trenches. The second and absolutely most deeply humiliating element of this totally devastating, highly coordinated ambush was the massive, completely unyielding heavy defensive fire. It screamed violently directly from their completely unauthorized, heavily prized collection of stolen, highly lethal German MG-34 machine guns. This created a massive, absolutely catastrophic psychological shock on the heavily contested battlefield. The highly disciplined, deeply confused German assault troops suddenly heard the incredibly distinctive, completely unmistakable, terrifying rapid-fire sound of their very own incredibly advanced, highly lethal MG-34 machine guns. They were tearing violently into their highly exposed front ranks directly from the supposedly poorly armed Australian defensive positions. Then the incredibly horrific, deeply embarrassing total realization finally crashed down upon them like a massive, undeniable ton of solid, heavily forged steel. The heavily besieged, supposedly starving and entirely written-off enemy forces were aggressively, highly efficiently overcoming their highly trained elite frontline soldiers. They were utilizing massive amounts of heavily stolen, highly advanced, absolutely top-tier German military hardware. This completely undeniable, deeply shocking historical fact later produced a totally unexpected, incredibly profound psychological impact on the legendary Desert Fox himself. In his highly celebrated, widely read personal memoirs, completely written and published years after the massive global conflict finally ended, General Rommel made a totally stunning admission. He very specifically praised the incredibly brilliant, highly stubborn Australian defense of Tobruk as a completely spectacular, absolutely undeniable, prime example of pure, practical military genius, operating completely without the distinct benefit of rigid, highly formal academic training, while General Rommel was busy carefully analyzing the brilliant, highly unconventional combat tactics of his fiercely stubborn opponents. The deeply entrenched British staff officers sitting safely in their luxurious headquarters in Cairo were slowly losing their absolute highly bureaucratic minds. The very first official intelligence reports detailing the massive, completely unauthorized deployment of captured enemy weaponry reached their comfortable desks roughly 3 weeks into the brutal, deeply terrifying siege. Their collective reaction was absolutely predictably pathetic. They totally ignored the desperate, highly traumatic survival of their frontline troops in favor of strictly maintaining outdated, completely useless military regulations. According to the highly rigid, deeply inflexible British Army manual, a proper, highly disciplined soldier must strictly fight exclusively using officially issued, highly regulated standard equipment. The massive, incredibly widespread utilization of stolen Axis firearms instantly created an absolutely massive, totally unprecedented, bureaucratic nightmare for the highly sensitive, totally out-of-touch logistics commanders stationed far away from the actual danger. They aggressively, highly ridiculously argued that an Australian soldier actively firing a stolen German MP-40 submachine gun absolutely required non-standard 9mm parabellum ammunition. This completely shattered their neat, perfectly organized logistical spreadsheets. Furious, highly demanding official inquiries were immediately dispatched across the highly dangerous waters of the Mediterranean Sea. General Leslie Morshead calmly read these utterly ridiculous, deeply insulting bureaucratic demands. He immediately performed an absolute, undeniable masterclass in pure, highly sarcastic diplomatic evasion, translated from polite, highly formal military jargon directly into plain, brutally honest reality. His message was incredibly simple and highly effective. He was essentially telling them that while they comfortably sat in safe offices writing totally useless papers, his desperate boys were actively using stolen guns to remain completely alive. He boldly challenged the wealthy, highly secure generals to either send fully functional, completely modern weapons or absolutely stay quiet and let his men fight. The pathetic British supply system predictably failed to ever normalize. The highly prized, deeply illegal trophy weapons remained actively firing on the heavily fortified Tobruk perimeter until the very end of the massive, world-famous siege. But this absolutely ridiculous, incredibly petty paper war was just a deeply embarrassing distraction from a massive, heavily classified underground operation that was about to completely blow the minds of the Allied command. The incredibly audacious Australian garrison was now literally driving, communicating, and aggressively shooting almost entirely at the sheer involuntary expense of the deeply humiliated Axis military forces. Their highly dangerous, absolutely terrifying nocturnal raids were no longer desperate acts of random survival. They had become incredibly calculated, highly organized logistical expeditions that operate exactly like a routine, totally mundane trip to the local grocery store. This was an absolutely mind-blowing, totally unprecedented system of military logistics turned completely upside down. It was fundamentally based not on receiving heavily delayed supplies from the friendly rear, but on aggressively extracting essential resources directly from the terrified enemy. By the incredibly hot end of May 1941, an absolutely staggering one-third of the entire Tobruk garrison transport fleet consisted entirely of stolen, heavily repainted enemy vehicles. This absolutely incredible, totally undeniable historical fact is not some wild, exaggerated myth from nostalgic post-war memoirs. It is an incredibly accurate, highly documented statistic pulled directly from the totally secret internal inventory logs of the 9th Division. Desperate to completely shut down this totally massive, heavily illegal military enterprise, the terrified British command dispatched a highly specialized, deeply strict military inspector directly to the besieged fortress in August 1941. This incredibly rigid, highly formal rule-following officer spent 2 incredibly shocking days touring the heavily bombarded, deeply entrenched defensive positions. His highly sheltered military mind was absolutely, completely blown. He witnessed hardened Australian infantrymen casually sitting in deep trenches with officially issued British Lee Enfield rifles resting right alongside completely illegal, highly prized German submachine guns. He stared in absolute, utter disbelief at the massive, totally unauthorized transport parks. Upon returning directly to the absolute safety of Cairo, this deeply shocked inspector wrote a highly detailed, totally explosive official report. His totally unexpected, completely honest conclusion openly admitted that utilizing stolen enemy equipment was the absolute only viable method of survival under the catastrophically poor British supply system. Yet the absolutely incredible, highly explosive statistics surrounding this terrifying military siege remained completely hidden from the general public for many long, deeply deceptive years. Oh, the legendary, completely unprecedented siege of this ruined desert port city lasted for an incredibly agonizing, totally brutal 242 days of absolute, unrelenting hell on earth. Behind this incredibly famous, highly celebrated historical number lies a deeply staggering, totally overwhelming statistical reality. Formal, heavily sanitized military historians consistently try to desperately avoid mentioning this in their perfectly polished educational textbooks. Over the highly traumatic course of those devastating 242 days, the incredibly stubborn, completely written off 9th Australian Division successfully repelled more than 30 massive, highly coordinated major enemy assaults. They captured an absolutely unbelievable amount of military loot that easily rivaled the total cargo value of several massive, highly protected naval supply convoys because of this massive, undeniable survival against absolutely impossible odds. The deeply embarrassed, highly incompetent British military establishment desperately tried to permanently erase the incredible story of the underground trophy arsenal from the official post-war narratives. They simply could not stomach the total, highly public humiliation of openly admitting that this completely surrounded, heavily outgunned garrison survived entirely in spite of their totally broken supply system rather than because of it. The official, highly sanitized Allied histories aggressively highlighted the immense bravery and stoic resilience of the troops. However, they very carefully, highly deliberately ignored exactly whose powerful, highly advanced weapons those incredibly brave men were actually firing into the darkness. But absolutely nothing could ever erase the incredibly iconic, deeply legendary moniker that was officially born in the very darkest, most terrifying early days of this massive historical siege. During a highly aggressive, heavily broadcasted German propaganda radio program aired on the 3rd day of April 1941, the infamous hostile broadcaster Hans Fritzsche viciously attempted to deeply humiliate the completely surrounded defenders. He mockingly, highly arrogantly referred to the trapped, deeply exhausted garrison as the totally doomed, absolutely pathetic Rats of Tobruk. However, in a totally brilliant, absolutely magnificent twist of pure psychological defiance, the incredibly hardened Australian diggers absolutely loved the vicious insult. They immediately claimed it as their highest, most honorable badge of immense military pride. However, the ultimate, most humiliating slap in the face to the highly elite British military establishment was yet to unexpectedly arrive, completely shocking the entire world. In the dusty, completely exhausted month of October 1941, the incredibly heroic, absolutely undefeated 9th Division was finally withdrawn from the deeply scarred fortress. They were replaced by freshly rested, fully equipped British and Allied military units. When the very last heavily armed, deeply hardened Australian soldiers finally sailed away from the heavily battered positions they had stubbornly held for more than 8 long, deeply traumatic months, they left behind something vastly more important than just a massive stockpile of stolen enemy weapons. They completely established an absolutely undeniable, totally monumental historical precedent. They proved definitively that a determined, highly adaptable military force can successfully function and aggressively dominate an enemy despite a completely catastrophic lack of official logistical support. But the absolute, most devastatingly humiliating historical contrast, perfectly illustrating the sheer brilliance of these Australian heroes, occurred exactly 1 year later. In the blazing hot month of June 1942, the heavily reinforced, incredibly powerful German and Italian forces finally managed to completely break through the defensive perimeter of Tobruk. The fortress was now fully guarded by completely different, heavily supplied British, South African, and Indian divisions. The absolutely tragic, totally catastrophic result of this massive new assault remains one of the absolute darkest, deeply embarrassing military failures in the entire incredibly long history of the British Empire. An absolutely staggering total of 33,000 fully equipped, highly professional garrison soldiers completely collapsed. They utterly surrendered the entire strategic fortress to the Axis forces in precisely one single, incredibly pathetic day. When the legendary British Prime Minister Winston Churchill officially received this utterly devastating, totally catastrophic news during a highly sensitive diplomatic meeting in Washington, eyewitnesses reported that his face turned so completely pale that the American president actually had to personally console him. The absolute, totally undeniable historical comparison was thoroughly devastating. 14,000 completely abandoned, supposedly doomed Australian soldiers, severely lacking normal supplies and heavily relying on completely stolen, highly illegal enemy weapons, successfully held the brutal line for 242 agonizing days against the brilliant Desert Fox. Exactly 1 year later, a vastly superior force of 33,000 fully supplied, completely professional troops operating without the brutal exhaustion of a massive, prolonged siege completely folded. They tragically gave up in exactly 24 short hours. This incredibly massive, totally unbelievable difference was not merely a simple matter of heavily unbalanced troop numbers or highly complex tactical troop deployments on the freezing desert sand. It was fundamentally about the deeply profound, highly psychological reality of exactly what happens when you aggressively back completely desperate, highly resourceful men into a completely inescapable corner and officially tell them they are entirely doomed. One specific group of heavily disciplined soldiers sadly accepts the grim bureaucratic prediction as an absolute unavoidable tragedy, obediently laying down their weapons in total defeat. The other group aggressively sneaks out into the freezing pitch-black night, audaciously steals the enemy's heavy transport trucks, and violently fights back using the enemy's very own top-tier rapid-fire machine guns. When an incredibly famous, highly respected Australian military historian sat down in the year 1986 to interview the deeply aged, highly revered veterans of this legendary siege, he asked one specific, highly controversial question. He asked an incredibly frail 80-year-old former frontline defender if utilizing highly illegal, heavily stolen enemy weapons was genuinely morally acceptable during the horrific, deeply chaotic reality of the massive siege. The deeply experienced, highly honorable veteran sat in absolute, completely heavy silence for a long, incredibly poignant moment, before finally delivering an absolute, totally devastating response that perfectly ended the useless bureaucratic debate forever. He simply stated that he was exactly 20 years old. He was totally surrounded by the most dangerous army on earth, and officially handed an absolutely pathetic, totally useless weapon that violently jammed every single time he desperately tried to fire it. He looked the historian completely dead in the eye and aggressively asked exactly what he was supposedly required to do in that terrifying moment. He fiercely questioned if he should have politely written a formal, highly useless letter of complaint to the wealthy bureaucrats in London. That completely brilliant, utterly unapologetic statement is the absolute raw core of genuine, totally unvarnished military history.